On March 14th, 1994, at 2:43 in the morning, every electronic system in Area 51's underground sector failed at the same time. Cameras, electromagnetic locks, pressurized ventilation, backup generators, everything. 22 minutes of total darkness, 90 meters below the Nevada desert. When the lights came back on, Cell 18 was empty. No holes in the walls, no sign of forced entry. The door was intact, the lock was in place, and the internal motion sensors, which run independently from all other systems, had registered absolutely nothing, simply empty. As if whatever had been in there for 44 years had decided, in that early morning darkness, that the time had come. The only scientist awake at that moment was Ethan Marcus Callaway. He was standing in the corridor when the lights returned. He stood in front of the empty cell for a length of time that none of the guards present could estimate with any precision. Some said it was 30 seconds. Others said it was several minutes. What everyone agrees on is what happened next. Ethan turned his back, walked down the corridor, handed his badge to the morning shift guard, and left the building. He didn't say a word, he didn't ask permission, he simply left, and never came back. What he knew in that moment, what he had discovered over 21 years inside that facility, is the reason for this video. Hey everyone, I'm Mystery and you're watching Military Archives.
If this is your first time here, welcome. This is the channel where we dive deep into stories that official records keep far from the front page. Sometimes those stories have an explanation. Sometimes they have an explanation that almost works. And sometimes, like today, we reach the end and realize the explanation we had was the wrong question entirely. Today I'm going to tell you a story that took me several weeks to research before I felt comfortable narrating. Not because it's absurd, quite the opposite. Because it's disturbingly coherent. Every piece fits the next in a way that kept me up at night for a few days. Before we get started, I need to give you the context for where all of this takes place. September 14th, 1950. The Nevada desert, approximately 83 miles northwest of Las Vegas, in a region that at the time was essentially sand, silence, and military secrecy. It's 11:47 p.m. when the radar at Nellis Air Force Base, one of the most monitored installations in the United States, picks up an object of indeterminate size descending over the desert along a trajectory that radar operators described in that night's report as non-ballistic and inconsistent with any catalogued aircraft. The entry speed was incompatible with any known technology in 1950. The impact speed was recorded as practically zero. The object didn't fall, it descended. A 6-man team from the Army Corps of Engineers was dispatched to the site. The operations commanding officer was Captain Gerald S. Pruitt, 38 years old, a Guadalcanal veteran decorated for bravery in the field. A man who, by all available accounts, was completely immune to exaggeration. The team arrived at the site at 2:20 a.m. The report Captain Pruitt signed that early morning has 3 paragraphs. The first 2 are standard procedure: description of the site, terrain conditions, absence of metal fragments or fuel traces. Ground temperature abnormally elevated in a circular area approximately 60 feet in diameter. No smell of burning. The third paragraph is where the report goes off the rails. And I'm going to quote exactly as it appears in the document, partially declassified in 2018 under the Freedom of Information Act, with government redactions kept where they exist. Object identified as organic, alive, contained without resistance. Transfer to designated facility initiated at 0305. Organic. Alive. Not spacecraft, not unknown technology, not metallic fragment of extraterrestrial origin. Organic and alive. I'm going to let that sit for a moment while we get to know the characters in this story. The man who will become the centre of this story arrives at Area 51 in August of 1973, 23 years after the capture. His name is Ethan Marcus Callaway, 34 years old, PhD in evolutionary biology from the University of Chicago, with a specialisation in comparative morphology, which is, essentially, the scientific study of how biological forms develop, change, and relate to each other over time. It's a field that requires you to look at a bone, a feather, a cellular structure, and read the evolutionary history written there. That's exactly the skill the US government wants to exploit. But before talking about what Ethan was professionally, I need to tell you who he was as a person, because that part matters a great deal for what's going to happen later. Ethan grew up in Tucson, Arizona, the only child of a Methodist pastor named Harold and a biology teacher named Ruth. If you're thinking that combination sounds like a recipe for domestic conflict, you're not wrong. Harold spent Sundays talking about miracles. Ruth spent weekdays talking about natural selection. Ethan grew up on the border between these two worlds, listening to both carefully and choosing one of them. He chose the data. Not out of resentment toward his father, the journals that survived from that period make it clear that Ethan deeply respected Harold Callaway, a gentle, intelligent man who saw faith not as an alternative to reason, but as something that existed on a different plane, inaccessible to the microscope and the scalpel. What Ethan rejected wasn't his father, it was uncertainty. He needed solid ground beneath his feet. Science gave him that ground. Faith didn't. So Ethan built an entire life on verifiable data. 2 papers published in Nature before he turned 30. A morphological analysis methodology adopted by 4 American universities. A reputation for being the kind of researcher who never publishes anything without certainty, which, in academic circles, is simultaneously a compliment and a warning. Outside the laboratory, Ethan's life was simpler. An apartment in Reno with a bookshelf, a chess table permanently set up for a game he played against himself, and a small, worn photograph hanging on the bedroom wall. The photo showed Harold Callaway standing beside his church pulpit, smiling at the camera. When anyone asked why he kept the photo, he wasn't religious, didn't attend any services, rarely mentioned his father. Ethan would shrug. "It's just a photo," he'd say. Always the same answer, as if repeating it enough times would make it true. There was also Claire. Claire Novak had entered Ethan's life in 1969, when the two were working in the same department at the University of Chicago. She was a geneticist, a compulsive reader, and one of the few people who could make Ethan genuinely laugh. In 1971, she had asked them to build something permanent together. Ethan said he wasn't ready. Claire left. She married a Chicago attorney in 1972. Ethan found out through a mutual friend. He didn't ask for details. What remained from that episode was a bottle of scotch in the cabinet above the sink, half empty since November of 1972, and the quiet awareness that it was the only decision in his life he genuinely regretted. In August of 1973, when the government car came to pick him up on a Tuesday morning, Ethan left everything as it was. The apartment, the chess table, the scotch, the photograph of his father. He thought he'd be back in a few weeks. He stayed 21 years. Before we continue, and I do need to continue because the story gets much stranger from here, let me give you a quick background on what Area 51 actually was in 1973. Most people know the name. Few know what was really happening inside. Area 51, officially called the Nellis Air Force Base Aircraft Testing Facility, located in the Groom Lake Basin in the state of Nevada, was, in the 70s, the United States' primary center for classified aerospace technology development. Projects like the U-2, the SR-71 Blackbird, and the early prototypes of what would become the F-117 Nighthawk were developed there. A lot of what people reported as UFOs in that region were actually experimental American aircraft being tested. That's what the official history says, and it's true, partially. What declassified documents from recent decades show is that Area 51 also had a secondary function, far less documented: the custody and study of materials and organisms of unidentified origin. There was a separate sector, referred to in internal documents as the underground sector, that operated at a different classification level from the rest of the installation. Personnel with access to the underground sector didn't automatically have access to the rest, and personnel in the rest of the installation didn't know what was down there. The person in charge of the underground sector since 1959 was Lieutenant Colonel Richard Avery Mossbrook, 51 years old, a two-conflict veteran, a specialist in the containment and management of non-conventional classified assets, which is the military euphemism for things we don't know what they are but can't let walk away. Mossbrook was the man who recruited Ethan.
And it was Mossbrook who, that August afternoon in 1973, sat across from Ethan Callaway, placed a folder on the table and said, "I have a specimen that none of your colleagues has been able to explain in 23 years. Let's see if you're different." Ethan opened the folder and stayed silent for a long time. In the first week, they didn't let Ethan see the specimen. Only the files, hundreds of pages, high-resolution photographs, biometric readings, reports from 12 different scientists who had passed through the program over the years. Ethan read everything in silence, in a windowless room, with a cup of coffee that went cold before he remembered it existed. What was in the files was disturbing, but within a spectrum Ethan could process, at least initially. A humanoid being with biological wings, approximate height of 6'3", skin of a greyish-pale tone, slightly translucent under artificial light, large eyes, no visible pupil, entirely golden iris, no colour gradient, wings with an approximate wingspan of 13 feet when fully extended, with feathers white in colour that progressively darkened toward a near black grey at the tips. From a morphological standpoint, Ethan's area, the wings were the most disconcerting element, not because they were large, but because of how they were large. The muscular structure needed to support wings of that size on a being of that weight would be anatomically incompatible with the humanoid spinal column described in the reports. The forces involved simply didn't work with the physics Ethan knew, but there was something in the files far more disturbing than the morphology. It was a single number. In the biometric records, in the metabolic monitoring section, there was a column called Recorded Daily Caloric Intake. Ethan went through the data line by line, expecting to see fluctuations, seasonal variations, some kind of trend over time. The entire column had a single value, 0, not low, not below human minimum, not traces of unverified ingestion, absolute 0, in every record, in every year, since 1950. In 23 years of custody, the being in cell 18 had ingested absolutely nothing. No food, no liquid, nothing. Ethan closed the file, went to Mossbrook, and said with all the calm he could muster, "There's an error in the caloric intake records." Mossbrook looked at him with the expression of a man who had heard exactly that sentence before, many times. "There's no error," said the Lieutenant Colonel. "We've verified it. Multiple times, with multiple teams." "That's biologically impossible." "Yes," agreed Mossbrook, with a placidity Ethan found unsettling. "It is." A pause. "Now that you've read the files," said Mossbrook, "let us show you cell 18. Ethan filed that detail in the back of his mind. He kept believing there was an explanation. He always believed there was an explanation. That was, at the same time, his greatest strength and his blind spot. I need to pause here to tell you a detail about how I found part of the material that underpins this story. In 2005, a religious studies professor at the University of Texas named Dr. Paul Serrano received, by mail, a package with no return address. Inside were photocopies of documents that appeared to be classified Area 51 records, and a handwritten notebook with the name Ethan M. Callaway on the cover. Serrano, fearing legal consequences, kept the package sealed for 2 years. In 2007, with the help of an attorney specializing in freedom of information, he began a slow and frustrating process of trying to authenticate the documents. Some were verified as consistent with the format and language of declassified Area 51 documents from the same period. Others could not be authenticated. Ethan's notebook, where the most personal parts of this story come from, could not be authenticated by conventional methods because there was no writing sample from Ethan to compare it against. He left very little documentary trace after 1973. So I'm going to be honest with you, part of what I'm about to tell you comes from verifiable sources. Part comes from partially verified documents, and part comes from the notebook, which may be Ethan's, maybe from someone who knew Ethan, or maybe a careful elaboration. I'll tell you which type of source I'm drawing from as we go. What I know for certain is this. In 2018, under the Freedom of Information Act, the US Department of Defense partially declassified 847 pages of documents related to the Program for the Custody of Unidentified Biological Assets. A program most people don't know existed. Those documents contain explicit references to a Subject Alpha held in custody at Area 51 between 1950 and 1994. Details about the nature of Subject Alpha are, on most pages, redacted in black. But redactions have edges, and sometimes what's at the edges is enough. The first time Ethan saw the prisoner of Cell 18 was on an August afternoon in 1973, with Mossbrook beside him, behind a 30-centimetre bulletproof glass. He stood in the doorway for a length of time he could never measure with any precision. It wasn't fear, at least not the kind of fear he knew, the fear of physical danger, of immediate threat. It was something different. In his journals, Ethan described that moment as the sensation of looking at something for which no category exists, like entering a room expecting to find an animal and finding something that, instinctively, you know doesn't belong to the taxonomy of anything that has ever existed. The creature was sitting in the centre of the cell, not in a chair, not on a mattress, not leaning against anything, simply sitting on the floor, legs crossed, wings folded behind it like a heavy cloak. The feathers were so organised they looked like a resting anatomy. Well, Jean, as if the wings knew, on their own, how to settle. The chest rose and fell, slowly, very slowly, but it rose. The golden eyes were open. Ethan stood there watching, and then, and this is the detail he describes in the notebook with a level of precision that convinced me it's real. The creature turned its head, not toward the window, not toward the glass, directly toward the exact point where Ethan was standing on the other side. No recognizable expression, no apparent curiosity, no aggression, no fear. The only word Ethan used to describe that gaze was recognition, as if something very ancient knew there was someone new on the other side, and was simply registering that fact. Mossbrook, beside Ethan, said nothing. He'd seen this scene before, he knew how it affected people. Ethan went back to his office that night and spent 3 hours writing notes. He tried to be systematic, he tried to be scientific. At the end of the notes, there was a single line he had crossed out with his pen, but not completely. Just lightly, like someone who doesn't want to erase something they wrote, but doesn't want it to be too visible either. The line said, "He saw me." In the following months, Ethan built a rigorous observation protocol. 18 hours a week in the observation room, biometric measurements every 6 hours, controlled stimulus response attempts, light in different spectra, sound frequencies between 20 Hz and 20 kHz, temperature variations between 39 degrees and 90 degrees Fahrenheit, physical objects introduced through the security compartment. The results were disturbing in their consistency. Subject Alpha responded to auditory stimuli at low frequencies, not with abrupt movements, but with a slight tilt of the head, like someone hearing a distant music that only they can pick up. To other stimuli, no discernible response. Body temperature, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, constant, regardless of the cell's temperature. Ethan tested this systematically over 3 months. At 39 degrees, 98.6. At 90 degrees, 98.6. No variation of 1/10 of a degree. Now, I need you to hold on to that detail for a moment, because it's more important than it sounds. In all known biology, the ability to maintain constant internal temperature, regardless of the environment, what we call homeothermy, requires energy. Energy that comes from metabolized food. This isn't an arbitrary rule. It's the second law of thermodynamics applied to biology. To maintain constant temperature, the body needs to burn fuel. Without fuel, temperature drops. Subject Alpha had no fuel, ate nothing, drank nothing, and maintained constant temperature. Those two things together violated something more fundamental than any biological law. They violated basic physics. Ethan wrote a detailed report on this. Mossbrook read it, thanked him formally, and filed it. "Keep observing," he said. "That's what you're here for." Ethan kept observing. The first serious incident happened in February of 1974, 6 months after Ethan's arrival. The guard's name was Dennis Holt, 28 years old, Army Sergeant, assigned to the night shift at Cell 18 since 1971. Son of Polish immigrants, raised in Milwaukee, a practicing Catholic who went to Mass every week even though the nearest church was 40 minutes away. Ethan and Holt had developed a cordial relationship, the kind that grows from shared shifts and bad coffee at 3 in the morning. They weren't close friends, but there was a mutual respect that Ethan rarely developed with people outside the academic environment. When Holt submitted a transfer request, Ethan noticed. He asked why one afternoon on a break, direct and without preamble, as was his style. Holt took a moment to answer. He looked at his own hands, then said, "I've been having dreams." Ethan asked what kind of dreams. About him, about what's in there. A pause, but in the dreams he speaks. Out loud. Words. A language I don't recognise, but in the dream I understand it completely. What does he say? When I wake up, it's gone. Holt looked at Ethan. But one thing stays, the feeling of what he's saying. It's like he's listing things, enumerating, places, names, like he's making a report for someone who isn't here. Ethan said nothing. He didn't know what to say. Holt's transfer request was denied by Mossbrook. 2 months later, a guard on the morning shift found Holt outside the facility, 2 kilometres from the building, walking barefoot in the desert at 3 in the morning, heading toward nothing, with his eyes open but with no awareness of where he was or how he'd gotten there. Holt was sedated, examined and reassigned to another section of the base. Ethan never found out what happened to him after that, and that's the first open loop of this story that was never closed. What Holt saw in the dreams, what he was doing in the desert at that hour, it was never explained in the documents I have access to. If anyone knows more about the fate of Dennis Holt, honestly, tell me in the comments. Let me stop here for a second, because I know there are people watching this who are coming to the story with different interpretive frameworks. Some of you are skeptics, and that's fine. Others have a religious framework that's already mapping what I'm describing onto something that's part of your belief system. And there are people in the middle who aren't sure what to think. I'm in that third group. What keeps me up at night isn't the idea that this is true. It's that I can't find the part where it's clearly false. 23 years without food, constant body temperature without metabolism, morphological correspondence with religious representations from cultures that never met, guards having dreams in languages they don't recognise, a Jesuit theologian reaching a conclusion that was literally cut out of the archives with scissors. Each of these elements, in isolation, has a rational explanation. Together, the rational explanation starts to ask for too much, but we haven't gotten to the part that disturbed me most. Let's keep going. In April of 1976, a neurologist named Dr. Carl Fenwick disappeared from the facility. He didn't die. He didn't resign. He wasn't transferred. He disappeared. Fenwick had been assigned to the program 6 months earlier, with a specific task of analysing Subject Alpha's brain activity using the EEG equipment available at the time. He was a meticulous researcher, according to colleagues who worked with him. The kind of man who arrived before everyone else and left after, who documented every observation in duplicate, who never took anything home. His room was found in perfect order. His lab coat was on the rack. His research notebooks were stacked on the desk. The coffee in his mug was still warm when they found it, as if he had stepped out to the bathroom and simply never come back. The incident was classified immediately. Ethan found out through cafeteria rumours, the kind of information that circulates at the edges of closed facilities, never confirmed, never denied. 3 weeks later, Ethan found on his desk, inside an unstamped envelope with no return address, a single typed sheet of paper. The content was a single research note. Apparently Fenwick's last entry, before his disappearance, copied by someone whose identity was never discovered. The note read, Day 847 of observation. Subject Alpha EEG shows a brain activity pattern with oscillation frequencies between 40 and 100 Hz. What neuroscience classifies as gamma waves, typically associated with states of high integration consciousness. The problem isn't the frequency, it's the amplitude. The amplitude of gamma waves recorded in Subject Alpha is 340 times greater than any reading from a human being recorded in all available scientific literature. For comparison, A person in deep meditation produces gamma waves with amplitude x. Subject alpha produces 340x. This is not abnormal consciousness, it is not pathology, it is something else entirely. Something for which I do not have scientific language to describe. I need to revise my baseline hypothesis about what I am measuring. Perhaps I am measuring with the wrong instrument. Perhaps I am the wrong instrument. That last line stopped me when I read it for the first time. Perhaps I am the wrong instrument. Ethan folded the paper, put it in his pocket, and went the rest of the night without sleeping. And here we arrive at the second open loop of this story that was never closed. The Fenwick paradox. What did he mean by that last line? What had he discovered that made him disappear? Who placed the note on Ethan's desk? And with what intention? I don't have answers. But what happens next completely reframes all of those questions. January of 1983. Ethan is 44 years old. He spent 10 years inside the facility. His hair, which was brown when he arrived, is now almost entirely grey. The apartment in Reno was sold years ago. He never went back to collect his things. He rents a room at a boarding house near the base that he uses essentially as a clothes storage unit. The bottle of scotch has been replaced by several. The photograph of his father he still carries. It was Mossbrook who, on a Tuesday morning without prior notice, appeared at the door of Ethan's laboratory. "We have files you haven't seen," said the Lieutenant Colonel, "from before your arrival. I've decided it's time." Ethan didn't ask why now. With Mossbrook, asking that question rarely resulted in an answer. He followed. The room where the archives were kept was on the deepest level of the underground facility, 1 floor below cell 18, in a corridor that Ethan had walked past hundreds of times without knowing there was a door there. The light was fluorescent and cold. The metal boxes on the shelves had labels with dates that started in 1950. Mossbrook left Ethan alone with the boxes, said he'd be back in a few hours. Ethan stayed 3 days. The first files were what he expected: military reports from the 1950 capture, photographs from the first months, communication attempts that had failed, preliminary medical analyses performed by military doctors who clearly didn't know what they were looking at. But in the boxes from the late 50s, Ethan found something he hadn't expected. A name. Father Thomas Aldrich, S.J. Jesuit priest, Professor of Comparative Religious Studies at Georgetown University, specialist in ancient religious iconography and non-canonical sacred texts, Moi, the writings that major religious traditions kept out of their official texts for reasons that ranged from theological to political. In 1957, the Department of Defense had quietly brought Aldrich to the facility. Not a biologist, not a physicist, a theologian. Aldrich's reports filled 2 full boxes. Ethan started reading. Aldrich had arrived at the facility with the same structured skepticism Ethan recognised in himself. A man of deep faith, but also an academic trained to separate data from symbol, observation from interpretation. His first reports were methodical and restrained. He described what he saw. He resisted the temptation to name. But as the reports advanced through time, weeks, then months of observation, there was a perceptible shift in tone, a restraint that was beginning to give way at the edges. What had set Aldrich on the path of revising his hypothesis was a seemingly simple exercise: morphological comparison. He had compiled, alongside the facility's archives, a collection of iconographic representations of winged humanoid beings from cultures around the world: Mesopotamian, pre-dynastic Egyptian, Jewish from the Second Temple period, early Christian, Islamic, Vedic Hindu, Zoroastrian, and more, smaller, less documented civilizations that had independently produced the same images. The initial goal was to find the differences, to demonstrate that the representations were distinct cultural projections, local variations of a universal archetype with no correspondence to any physical reality. What he found was the opposite. In cultures that had never had historical contact with each other, separated by oceans, by millennia, by absolute linguistic barriers, the representations of winged humanoid beings shared specific and recurring proportions. Wingspan approximately twice the height of the being, wings with colouring that darkened at the tips, eyes described in multiple unrelated languages as like molten gold or like light that has no source. And more, the apocryphal texts, the writings that official religious traditions had chosen not to include in their canons, contained far more detailed physical descriptions than the canonical texts, as if the traditions knew, at some institutional level, that too many physical descriptions were inconvenient. Aldrich wrote in his 12th report, "The hypothesis that these representations are theological metaphors, projections of the divine in humanly comprehensible forms, does not survive comparative examination. Metaphors from distinct cultures diverge. These converge. The convergence in specific proportions, in specific visual characteristics, in specific behaviours, strongly suggests that the different traditions were describing the same type of entity. Not a symbol. A being." Ethan read that line 3 times, then continued. Aldrich's subsequent reports grew progressively more technical and more disturbed at the same time. He had begun cataloguing the behaviours attributed to the beings in textual traditions, what the text said the beings did, how they interacted with humans, how they communicated, what effects they produced in those nearby, and then compared them with the facilities reports. Guards reporting dreams in unidentified languages, described in 3rd century Ethiopian text as a typical effect of proximity to what they called messengers at rest. Beings who, when not on active mission, continued transmitting unconsciously, like a radio no one had turned off. The absence of food intake. In the Nag Hammadi texts, Homar Anti, the archive of Gnostic writings found in Egypt, in 1945, there was a specific section on what the authors called the nature of the Elyonim, describing them as beings who did not depend on material substance to exist, because their existence was of a different order from matter. The constant temperature regardless of environment. No direct textual parallel, but Aldrich noted that multiple traditions described the beings as emanating their own warmth, a characteristic that, he argued, could be interpreted as absolute homeothermy. And then, and here is where Aldrich's reports made a leap that clearly frightened him, there was the behaviour that Ethan had repeatedly documented in his early years, the creature turning its head toward observers who were beyond the range of normal vision, as if perceiving presence through another sense. In Hebrew apocalyptic text, specifically in the Book of Enoch, a text that the Jewish tradition knew but chose not to include in canonical scripture, there was a passage that Aldrich had underlined with a heavy stroke. "And the messenger knew all who drew near, for he did not see with his eyes, but with that which was before his eyes." Ethan stood still with that line for a long time. Aldrich's last report, the 19th mine, was in the final box, separated from the others by a thick cardboard divider. It was shorter than the previous ones. The handwriting was different, faster, less careful, like someone writing under pressure of time or emotion. Ethan read, "After 7 months of comparative analysis, I have arrived at a conclusion I cannot present as a working hypothesis, because I have no way to falsify it through the scientific method. I can only present it as the most parsimonious interpretation of the available data. I do not believe we are dealing with an extraterrestrial being in the conventional sense, an organism of planetary origin different from Earth. The extraterrestrial hypothesis is, ironically, the one that holds up least well against the body of evidence, what the texts of the Abrahamic traditions call malak, messenger, in Hebrew, what late Greek called angelos, what Arabic calls malak, what Ethiopic calls melakt, what Indian texts call diva. These are not metaphors, they are records of observation. People in different cultures across millennia observed the same type of entity and described what they saw with the language available to them. What we have here in Cell 18 is one of these beings, captured, kept in captivity, and completely incapable of aging, dying, or requiring nourishment. Not for biological reasons, but for reasons that biology, as a discipline, is simply not equipped to address. I must stop here because what follows, the sentence was cut off, not crossed out, not redacted in black like in government documents. Cut, with scissors or a blade, with a precision that suggested deliberateness. Someone had removed the rest of that report. What remained was only the clean cut in the paper and the white space below. Ethan sat with that paper in his hand. For a time he describes in the notebook as immeasurable, Then he did what he always did when he needed to think. He began listing what he knew as verifiable fact. A being captured in 1950, no signs of aging in 33 years of custody, no food intake in 33 years, verified by multiple teams with multiple protocols. Body temperature absolutely constant in any ambient condition. Brain activity with amplitude 340 times above the maximum recorded in any human. The ability to perceive human presence beyond the range of normal vision. Specific and detailed morphological correspondence with representations of supernatural beings in civilizations without historical contact with each other, across at least 5,000 years of human record. And a report from a Jesuit theologian who reached a conclusion that was physically removed from the archives. Ethan thought about the photograph he still carried in his pocket. Harold Callaway, standing by the pulpit smiling, the man who believed that some things exist before the categories we use to describe them. Ethan rose from his chair, left the archive room, climbed the stairs, and walked to the observation window of cell 18. The creature was where it always was, sitting on the floor, wings folded, golden eyes open, static vigil. Ethan looked for a long time, then said out loud, knowing that the 30-centimetre bulletproof glass probably made any sound inaudible on the other side. "Who are you?" The golden eyes moved, slowly, with a deliberateness Ethan had never recorded in 10 years of observation. Not toward the window, not toward the glass, toward a point that seemed to lie beyond all of that, exactly where Ethan was standing. And for a moment, just a moment, before Ethan took a step back and walked away, he had the physical, unmistakable sensation that something very old and very large was looking back. Not at him, through him. Let me stop here for a second. Because when I read what Ethan wrote that night in the notebook, and there are 5 pages about that specific moment, 5 pages from a man who had spent his entire life refusing to name what couldn't be measured, it's hard not to feel the weight of it. He writes about his father. He spends an entire page writing about Harold Callaway, about the tension of growing up between 2 worlds that never reconciled inside that house, about how he had chosen one of them and built an entire identity around that choice. And then he writes a line that, honestly, is the line that convinced me this notebook is real. He writes, "I spent my life judging my father for believing in things that couldn't be demonstrated. Now I'm standing before something that cannot be demonstrated any other way, and what I feel isn't scientific wonder. It's something I only know in one way. It's what I feel when I look at his photograph. I'm not going to say I know what that means, but I know what I feel when I read it. Let me be completely honest with you here. The rational explanation exists, and it's a good one. I'm not going to pretend it isn't, because pretending would be dishonest. And intellectual dishonesty is what separates this channel from cheap sensationalism. So let's take each element of this story and look at it through the lens of the most reasonable explanation available. The absence of food intake. Biologically impossible? Yes, but only if the monitoring protocols were airtight. In a military high-security custody facility with multiple staff rotations, it's conceivable that ingestion of minimal amounts of substances went unrecorded or occurred through means the monitoring of the time couldn't detect. Protocol error in long-running systems is a legitimate explanation. The constant temperature. This can also have a more mundane explanation. The human body has thermoregulation mechanisms that, in certain altered metabolic states, produce relative stability, not 340 days of perfect stability at any ambient temperature. But the data may have been less absolute than the reports suggest. The guard's visions, sleep deprivation, isolation, high psychological pressure, and the well-documented phenomenon of collective suggestion, especially in closed environments where everyone knows they're guarding something strange. Those factors are sufficient to produce shared dream experiences without any external cause. Aldrich's iconographic correspondence. The archetype theory, developed by Jung, argues that the human mind in any culture produces the same images because it shares the same neurological structure. Wings are universal metaphors for transcendence. Luminescence is a universal metaphor for divinity. The similarities are not evidence of a real being. They're evidence that human beings, everywhere, think in similar ways. I give full credit to each of these points. Any responsible researcher starts with them. The problem is a single laboratory result that none of these explanations can absorb. In 1989, after 16 years of observation, Ethan Callaway obtained by means he didn't fully detail in the notebook, and that probably involved a protocol violation. He consciously chose not to document a single tissue sample from subject alpha, a feather, apparently shed naturally during routine maintenance of the cell, collected before the cleaning crew had access to the space. Ethan sent it, without identifying the origin, to a molecular biology laboratory at the University of Nevada, with which he had maintained collaboration before Area 51. He requested a standard genetic analysis, DNA sequencing, chromosome identification, compatibility report with known databases. 2 weeks later, the lab made contact by phone. The researcher who had performed the analysis, whose name Ethan notes in the notebook but which I'm choosing not to repeat here for reasons that will seem obvious, said there was a problem with the sample. There was no DNA, not non-human or unrecognizable DNA, not degraded or contaminated DNA, not inconclusive result. The tissue was biologically active. The cells were alive, structurally intact, with cell membranes functioning normally. The researcher had verified cellular viability before attempting the sequencing. The cells responded to stimuli, maintained electrochemical gradient, performed basic metabolic exchanges. But there was no deoxyribonucleic acid in any of them. There is, in all known biology, no exception to this rule. Living multicellular tissue contains DNA. DNA is the instruction code the cell uses to know what it is, how to function, how to replicate. Without DNA, the cell doesn't know it's a cell. Without DNA, the cell doesn't exist. The wing tissue existed. It was alive, and it had no code. Ethan asked the researcher to repeat the analysis. The result was the same. He asked them to try other approaches, RNA sequencing, protein analysis, anything that might indicate some functional analogue to DNA that simply hadn't been identified by standard methods. Weeks later, the researcher called back. The protein analysis had produced results that were even more disturbing. The proteins in the tissue had three-dimensional structure, but there were no amino acids, the building blocks of any known protein in any of the samples. It was like finding a building constructed without bricks. The researcher said in the final call that he had decided not to formally document the analysis. Not because I'm afraid, he said, but because I don't know what box to put it in. The rational explanation has no box for it. I looked. I didn't find one. March 14th, 1994. It's 2:43 in the morning when the systems fail. Ethan is on the underground level, not in the observation room, but in a nearby corridor, reviewing notes from that afternoon session. When the lights go out, he goes completely still. After 21 years in the facility, he knows every emergency protocol. He knows what should happen in the next 30 seconds. Backup generator, emergency lighting, mechanical containment locks. Nothing happens. The darkness is complete. And it's silent in a way Ethan describes as the silence of something breathing together. He stays still for 22 minutes, not because he's afraid of walking in the dark, but because he feels, with a certainty he can't rationally explain, that whatever is happening in that moment is not a technical problem, and that he shouldn't interfere. When the lights come back on, he goes directly to cell 18. The door is intact. The lock is in place. The 30-centimetre glass is in perfect condition. There are no marks on any surface. And inside the cell, where for 44 years there had been a figure sitting on the floor, with golden eyes and folded wings, there is only the clean concrete floor. Ethan looks into the cell for a long time. Then, and here I'm quoting directly from the notebook because no paraphrase would do it justice, I felt no fear. I felt no relief. I felt what I feel when I finish a very long book I didn't want to end. A sadness and a completeness at the same time. As if the story had arrived where it needed to arrive. And then he smiled. The guards who were in the corridor that early morning unanimously described the same detail in their debriefing reports. Ethan Callaway, standing in front of the empty cell 18, with a smile on his face. Not of joy. Not of triumph. Of recognition. Ethan walked down the corridor without hurrying. He went down the stairs. He reached the ground floor security checkpoint. He took the ID badge from around his neck, placed it on the counter in front of the duty guard. A 22-year-old soldier who'd been at the facility for 3 months and had never seen that face before. 5 a.m, "Okay," and said only, "It's over." He walked out through the main security door. There was no car waiting for him. There was no planned exit. Ethan simply started walking. In the following months, the attempt to locate Ethan produced very little. He wasn't in Reno, the apartment had been sold years ago, and he had left no mailing address. He wasn't in Tucson. His mother, Ruth Callaway, 74 years old at the time, told the agents who appeared at her door that she hadn't seen her son in 8 years and didn't know anything. There was no record of him passing through American airports in the weeks following the disappearance. In September of 1994, 6 months after leaving Area 51, a former colleague from the University of Chicago received a letter. No return address. The postmark read, Marfa, Texas. The letter was 1 page. It said Ethan was well, that he had decided to live somewhere without internet and without noise, that he had spent the last months thinking about things he hadn't had time to think about before. And then a line that the colleague memorized and repeated years later in an interview with a journalist investigating the case. "I spent my entire life documenting everything. Now I understand that there were things that weren't mine to measure. There were things that were only mine to witness." The colleague tried to find him in Marfa. He travelled to the city, spent a week asking around. No one had seen a man matching that description. In 2003, a religious studies professor at the University of Texas named Dr. Paul Serrano received, by mail, a package with no return address. Inside, photocopies of classified Area 51 documents and a handwritten notebook with the name Ethan M. Callaway on the cover. On the last page of the notebook, a single line written in handwriting different from the rest, more careful, as if from someone who knew it was the last thing they would write there. There are things that, when revealed, do not free people. They bind them. What was in cell 18 should not bind anyone. Let it remain free. Let it remain what it is. Ethan was never found. Guys, let me tell you what really disturbed me about this story. It wasn't the absence of DNA in the tissue. Although that's probably the element hardest to explain rationally, and I tried. It wasn't the disappearance without a trace, or to Sturticum. Although it is remarkable that in 1994, with all the monitoring infrastructure available, a man with a top-level security clearance vanished from Area 51 and was never seen again. What disturbed me was the smile. That smile that the guards described in their 3 sentences, each of them dedicated to the moment in their debriefing reports, and who, independently, used very similar words to describe it. Peaceful. Like someone who had just understood something. Like he knew it was going to happen. Ethan Callaway spent 21 years studying something he couldn't classify. 21 years building hypotheses that didn't hold up completely. 21 years reading files, taking measurements, waking up at 3 a.m. to take notes. And when the cell was empty, he smiled. He didn't call Mossbrook. He didn't activate any protocol. He didn't try to investigate what had happened. He simply handed in his badge and left, like someone who had reached a conclusion. I have an opinion about what was in cell 18. I'm not going to pretend I don't, because on this channel we don't sit on the fence. But I'm going to tell you my opinion with one condition. It doesn't exclude yours. I think Father Aldrich was right. Not necessarily in the theological interpretation. I have no way of knowing what angel means in real metaphysical terms, and I'm not the right person for that debate. But I think he was right about the diagnosis. What was in that cell was not extraterrestrial in the sense of from another planet. It was something of a completely different order. Something that existed before our taxonomy, before our categories, before our science. And I think Ethan Callaway spent 21 years slowly arriving at the same conclusion, and that when he got there, he wasn't disturbed. He was at peace. Now here's the question that hasn't left my head since I finished researching this story. If you were in Ethan's position, with everything he knew, with the notebook in your hands, with the possibility of revealing to the world what had been imprisoned in that cell for 44 years, would you have revealed it? Or would you have done what he did? Because Ethan didn't stay silent out of cowardice. He didn't stay silent out of loyalty to the government. He stayed silent because he decided, and the last line of the notebook is quite clear about this, that some things should not be prisoners. Not of Area 51, not of a YouTube video, not of the human need to classify what cannot be classified. I don't know if he was right, but I understand why. Whatever was in Cell 18 for 44 years didn't come from another planet. It came from long before humanity existed. Or, depending on what you believe, from a place that has no geographic coordinates. And on March 14th, 1994, 22 minutes after the lights went out in the Nevada desert, it left the same way it arrived, without leaving a trace, except for a handwritten notebook on a shelf at the University of Texas, and a grey-haired man who may still be somewhere, in Marfa, Texas, or further away, living in a piece he couldn't find while he was still trying to document everything. I really want to know what you think, especially this. Do you think it was an angel? An alien? Something that has no name in either category? Tell me in the comments. I read all of them, and this is exactly the kind of debate that makes me want to keep researching. If this story got to you in some way, share it with someone you think needed to hear it. And if you're not yet subscribed to Military Archives, do it now. Hit the bell too, because the next story I have for you is about another file that shouldn't exist, and that someone found. I'm Mystery. Until next time.